All right, in this lesson, we are going to be talking about pesticides. But first, I want to just do one quick thing from the previous lesson. We're talking about pollinators and about bees. So bees and honeybees and other similar insects provide an estimated $15 billion per year in pollination services, meaning they're not making that money, but basically they are pollinating these plants by just living their lives and flying from flower to flower. But wild populations are declining really steeply across North America. You've probably heard about this. So the reason that they think these populations are declining is because they're being killed by insecticides. So chemicals that are meant to kill insects are killing them. That there have been new parasites and pathogens. So bacteria or smaller insects or whatever might be to live off of them or to kill them as pathogens from human trade and travel. So as globalization has continued, we've introduced new predator parasites and pathogens that will harm the bees, as well as habitat and flower loss due to application of herbicides on farms and lawns. So we're destroying the flowers that they normally pollinate, like dandelions. There's always honeybees on dandelions, but those are seen as weeds to humans. So we get rid of the flowers, and then the bees no longer have a place to eat. So because of that, we are observing what's called colony collapse disorder, which is kind of a mystery, but it's just has caused about up to a third of all honeybees each year to die in the US. And they believe it's a combination of all the three factors we just talked about. So it's becoming really a big problem because we need these bees as pollinators for our plants, whether or not they're crops or just wildlife. And so we've one of the strategies has been to preserve these buffer strips of wildflowers surrounding farms and along highways to preserve pollinators. So if we keep these wildflowers there for the bees to pollinate, even though we're farming here or there's a highway there, whatever it might be, we're promoting the bees to have a habitat and a place to live. Okay, so now we're into the next lesson, and we're going to talk about controlling pests and weeds. So by definition, a pest is any organism that damages crops or livestock, and a weed is any plant that competes with crops. So those are the language that we're going to use. And the book focuses on the fact that inherently, no plants or insects or animals are pests or weeds. It's a relationship that humans view to be negative, so we want to get rid of them. These plants are simply growing or behaving naturally, or plants or insects, but they're affecting the way that we are trying to grow our lawns or our crops or whatever it might be. Industrial monocultures limit the ability of natural enemies to control pest populations. So basically, since ecosystems naturally manage their populations through food chains and through things like that, but since we are destroying ecosystems and building monocultures of one crop, we don't have that natural food chain happening there. So farmers have had to turn to chemical suppression, also known as pesticides. So pesticides include synthetic chemicals, so chemicals that we have made, that are killing insects, which we would call insecticides, excuse me, plants, which are called herbicides, and fungi, which would be called fungicides, so killing mushrooms and things like that. And nearly 400 million kilograms of ingredients, or 900 million pounds, from pesticides are applied in the U.S. each year. That's 3 pounds of pesticides applied per person in the U.S., so it's pretty crazy. And since 1960, the worldwide use of agriculture has increased 4 times. So we're using a lot more pesticides has increased 4 times. So we're using a lot more than we used to. So pesticides have really boosted food production, but the problem, they've boosted food production. They help keep us pest-free in our homes. If you don't like having bugs or ants or bees or spiders or things like that in your house, pesticides can help with that. They help give us nice lawns by killing weeds. And they also help protect people from insect-borne illness, like where countries that have malaria outbreaks, you can kill the insects, kill the mosquitoes, and then you're not going to be spreading the disease. But the problem is that exposure to pesticides can really have health problems for people. So farmers have the highest level of exposure because they're around them all the time. But old children who are still growing, their brains and bodies are still growing, are also really affected by them. And consumers we eat pesticides on a daily basis when we eat any non-organic produce, because organic produce is grown free of pesticides, so any produce that is not organic has been treated with pesticides. Another problem, and these pesticides that we're consuming every day are not necessarily tested for their safety. So if you think about it, pesticides are meant to kill weeds or insects or whatever it might be. And while we are very different than a fly or very different than a dandelion or very different than a mushroom, the way that our physiology, the way that our cells work isn't so different. We have the same proteins, we have the same DNA. And so whatever is killing the insects, whatever is killing the flies that are eating the plant, it's targeting a protein or it's targeting something that we may also have in our bodies. And it might be different, and that's why we're not falling over dead, but if it accumulates, or it can still cause damage to another living thing. And additionally, pesticides are going to also kill non-target organisms, because one fly is not going to be different enough from another fly or from another insect that it's only going to kill the thing that we want and not something else. So we're also killing predators and parasites of pests and pollinators. So we are also, while we're killing pests, we're also killing the things that naturally control the pests. So we are not only causing harm to ourselves, but we're disrupting the natural cycle of keeping these pests at bay. So for example, is there a picture of this? No. There's a plant called milkweed, and Roundup is a common brand of weed killer that will kill the milkweed, but it has reduced the milkweed population so much that monarch butterflies live and eat only on milkweed, and so we have really caused a decrease in the monarch butterfly population because we've been killing the place that they live and eat. And there's a new class of chemical insecticide in use today called neonicotinoids, and the way that these work is that they make the plant toxic to the insects that feed on them. So it's put into seeds, and then the seeds grow up to be plants that are harmful to insects. Excuse me. But they also harm the bees that pollinate the plants, and they harm the predators that are eating the insects that are harming the plants. So it's doing what we want it to do, but also has a lot of unintended side effects. And these neonicotinoids can also enter the soil and water supply, so they can kill other organisms that have no threat at all to crops. So they're having a much wider array of effects than we would hope. And another problem is that as we're killing off pests, we're creating resistance to pesticides. So basically, they become less effective over time. So think about it. Most pests occur in such huge numbers that it's really likely that there's a few of them in each population that already have evolved, mutated a new gene that will allow them to not die from this, whatever the pesticide is. Their body can process it without it killing them. So if there's just a few of these insects in a huge population, or let's look at the picture. So these pests are attacking the crops. So the pesticide is applied. A lot of times it's applied from a low-flying plane. It drops it over the crops. It's pretty cool if you've seen it happening. And then what this says here, which you might not be able to see, is that most pests are killed. A few with innate resistance survive. So these few have somehow evolved the ability to not be killed by this pesticide. So the majority of them are dead. We did our job. However, these guys, natural selection, these guys are going to survive. Now we've created an entire pesticide-resistant population. So when we go back to use the same pesticide, it's not going to work. So we're going to have to go on and make a new pesticide. So basically what we're doing is encouraging the evolution of our pests in what we call an evolutionary arms race. So they become stronger, so we use the stronger ones. They become stronger, so we use a stronger one. And it's what's called the pesticide treadmill, because it's just a cycle of resistance, new pesticide resistance, new pesticide resistance. Another way to help with pests is what's called biological control, which does not involve pesticides, but instead pits one organism against each other. So what we do is we use natural predators or parasites to eliminate a pest. Excuse me. So the example of this given here is what was performed in Australia and Argentina, because this cactus was overtaking rangeland. So it was the prickly pear cactus that was overtaking the land where they were trying to raise their livestock. So what they did was they introduced a cactus moth, and the cactus moth lays its eggs on the cactus, and then the larva, they eat the cactus. And so it's really successful at keeping cactus populations down. And it worked really, really well in Australia in the 1920s. So this was before the cactus moth introduction and after the cactus moth introduction. So we basically were able to eliminate the pest, in this case, the weed, the cactus moth. And there's been several other examples of this working. Another one is using a bacteria. So this one in particular is called BT. I'm not going to try to say that. It's a soil bacteria where it produces a protein that's going to kill a lot of caterpillars, some fly, and beetle larvae. So we can spray it directly on the plants. And even now some plants are able to produce this protein on their own. So it's able to kill the caterpillar as well as the fly and beetle larvae so that they don't end up eating them. But the problem is that as we mess with natural ecosystems and natural food webs, I'm sure that you would know that we might have a negative outcome. So if we're going to introduce so sometimes what scientists will do is if there's a pest that is a non-native species, so let's say there's a fly that came from someplace else and is now eating something it shouldn't be doing, scientists will try to bring in a predator from its natural habitat to try to kill it. And sometimes that'll work, but obviously I'm sure you could guess that it is really risky because we can't predict the full effects of what bringing in another new species will do. And so like we said, the cactus moth was so successful in Australia that it was also brought in to fight the prickly pear cactus in the Caribbean countries. But what it did was that it moved on its own to Florida and it started taking out native cactus populations there. And they're worried that if these moths reach Mexico and the southwestern US, so where we are, that they could decimate and take out tons of native and really economically important species of prickly pear cactus. So, and that's really hard to stop. So there's a lot of unintended consequences. So the biological control agents can become pests themselves. So the last one that we're talking about is integrated pest management, which combines biocontrol, so using other organisms to help us, chemical pesticides, habitat alteration, crop rotation, transgenic crops, alternative tillage methods, and mechanical pest removal. So it's basically just an integrated, meaning taking a lot of different things, method to control these pests, which is exactly what it's called. And it's been seen to be very successful. Indonesia has done a ton with this, which they've cut down their pests. So they've been able to increase their rice population and get rid of rice production and get rid of the brown planthopper, which is a pest that was killing the rice fields. They were actually using subsidies, so the government was paying farmers to use pesticides. That way they would be able to grow enough rice to feed the population. But then they realized that the pesticides were actually making pest problems worse. So what they did is that they canceled the subsidies and started using integrated pest management, and they brought in all these scientists to teach their farmers how to use it rather than pesticides. And within 4 years, just 4 years, which is a really short amount of time to make a big change like that, pesticide production fell by half, pesticide imports fell by 2/3, and subsidies were phased out completely, which saved the taxpayers $180 million annually, and the rice yields rose by 13%. So it was a pretty successful endeavor.